It was a Monday morning, and I almost laughed when I saw the lunchbox my daughter-in-law had packed for my son glittering as if rimmed with sugar. But just seconds later, that laugh died on my lips. I handed the container to my coworker, Dr. Caldwell. He didn't smile at all. He rubbed a single crystal grain between his fingers, and his hands started to shake. "That's not sugar, Margaret," he said in a low, cold voice. My throat went dry. I saw the image of my son sitting, sipping the soup his wife had packed, his wedding band catching the light, and that light was now turning the harmless-looking powder into a deadly warning. The spoon slipped from my hand. Caldwell looked straight at me, his eyes brooking no panic. "Call your son now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." My body remembered how to move before my mind did. I reached for my phone, but my hands had gone slick. The lavender in the room turned sharp like a metallic note buried in a familiar song. I knew that smell too well. It was the scent of my life's work, and it used to calm me. Today, it was a witness. Caldwell's hand hovered near mine, steadying the phone just long enough for me to see Andrew's name. I pressed call and counted the beats in my chest while the line rang. 1, 2, 3. Voicemail. I tried again. 1, 2. Still no answer. "Leave a message," Caldwell said. "Make it ordinary. Make it now." I kept my voice the way I used to, when Andrew was small and woke from a nightmare. "Andrew, it's Mom. Swing by St. Mary's Clinic for a quick check when you can. Tell no one. Text me when you get this." I ended the call and stared at the container as if it might blink. The grains on the rim looked harmless in the light. Some part of me wanted to believe I had imagined Caldwell's tremor. Another part had already started packing the pieces of my life into a bag like a woman who knows a storm is on the way. She even seasoned love with sweetness, I told him, because I needed the sentence to exist outside my body. Grace had tucked that container into Andrew's briefcase this morning while humming a tune from the radio. She had kissed my cheek. She had said, "Take care of him today, Margaret. He has such a hard week ahead." Those words lie across my memory now like frost on a window. Caldwell cut through them with a single line. "That's not sugar, Margaret." He moved quickly but carefully. "No powder under your nails," he said, and ushered me to the sink. The faucet squealed and ran cold, and I scrubbed until my fingers felt unfamiliar. He slid the container into a clear bag and sealed it with a press that sounded final. His eyes had that precise focus I had seen on him decades ago when we worked the night shift and a mystery toxin threaded through a patient's blood. "Not a tutorial," he said. "A boundary. We do not teach evil how to repeat itself. We simply recognize it when it tries to dress as kindness." The spoon on the floor kept echoing in my head as if the tile had not stopped ringing. The sound followed me out of the lab, down the stairwell, and into the street. Winter sun on Portland glass. A bus hissed and pulled away. I called Andrew again while Caldwell flagged a cab. Voicemail. I texted him in words as small and sharp as pins. "Check up. Quietly. Alone. Trust me." The driver glanced at the clear bag in Caldwell's lap and then at my face in the rearview mirror. He said nothing, thank God. The city blurred by, and I found myself counting the landmarks like I was stitching time together. The bakery where Andrew bought me a cranberry scone for my last birthday. The bridge that caught the river and held it like a steady palm. The park where I watched him as a boy run until his shoelaces trailed like tails behind him. Love arrives in images long before it speaks. Fear does too. "Call him again," Caldwell said. I obeyed. The third ring cut off with a click, and Andrew's voice filled my ear. "Hey, Mom, I'm in a meeting. What is wrong?" He sounded bright and tired at the same time, the way he has for months now, and I hated how quickly my memory lined those months up into a pattern. I said, "This is small, but it cannot wait. Go to St. Mary's on Hawthorne, Lab 2. Say you are here to see Dr. Caldwell. Do not tell Grace, and do not eat anything until I see you." He did not argue the way he might have when he was 20. He only exhaled and said, "I am on my way." When the line went dead, I held the phone to my chest the way old women hold prayers. Caldwell watched me with a kind of respect that made me want to cry. My mind chased its own tail through scenes from the morning. Grace at my counter in a cream sweater, moving through my kitchen like choreography. She had teased me about how I still labeled jars in my old slanted handwriting. She had reached for my hand so easily that I had not noticed the small question she floated as lightly as steam above a pot. Had I ever thought about stepping back from the company? Had I chosen an heir? She said it as if she were asking about the weather. That is how ambition speaks when it wants to be loved. The cab rolled to a stop in front of St. Mary's. Caldwell helped me out, and the winter air hit my lungs like cold glass. Inside the lobby, a volunteer smiled and handed us visitor stickers. Lavender clung to my coat. It should have soothed me. Instead, it felt like the wallpaper of a house I no longer trusted. We found the corridor for labs, and Caldwell lifted the bag slightly. The receptionist went pale in a practiced way and nodded us through. He said to her in a voice as clean as a scalpel, "We are preserving evidence and need a non-invasive analysis. No steps, no instructions, just a result." She had seen enough life to understand a line when it is drawn. She paged the right people. I waited by the window at the end of the hall and watched the parking lot. My reflection hovered in the glass, and I realized I had not eaten. My stomach twisted not with hunger but with a hollow ache that had the shape of a question. When had Andrew started looking drawn around the mouth? When had he begun rubbing his sternum at dinner and laughing it off as nerves from the market? How many nights had I told him to sleep earlier while Grace pressed a glass into his hand with a smile that was all pearly light and no warmth? The thought landed and sat heavily. Some truths do not arrive until you stop pretending you do not see them. My phone buzzed and I flinched. Andrew. He said, "I am downstairs." I told him to go to Lab 2 and wait in the side room. "I will meet you in a minute." I turned to Caldwell and, for the first time, said the thing I had kept behind my teeth. "Say it to me like I am stupid, so I will not mishear it. If it is what you think it is, then I need to hear the word." He met my eyes for a long time, and then he said it quietly, the way a doctor tells a mother about a diagnosis that will rearrange her house. "Arsenic." The syllables made the air colder. I did not collapse. I did not scream. I leaned on the wall and inhaled in counts of 4, the way nurses teach you when a needle is about to enter your skin. The lavender note in the corridor shifted, and now it smelled like memory found something broken inside it. The world did not tilt. It narrowed. To my son. To this bag. To the line between trust and negligence. I heard myself say a sentence that belonged to a woman older and harder than me. "We are not going to accuse without proof. We are going to guard him and gather what we need." Caldwell nodded once. "That is why I asked you to call him at once," he said. "Poison is not always a dagger. Sometimes it is a teaspoon." I moved toward the side room. Andrew was standing by a chair as if it were a cliff. He looked at my face and put his hands on my shoulders. He said, "Just tell me." I told him only what the moment could hold. "We found something in your lunch. We are checking. Until we know more, do not touch food you did not make yourself." He nodded in the careful way of a man stepping across a river on stones. He did not say his wife's name. I did not say it either. Silence sometimes carries more truth than any interrogation. Caldwell guided Andrew to the nurse who would draw a routine sample. No drama, no alarms, just a line on a sheet and a request for a particular panel. The nurse moved with the calm of someone who has learned to respect panic by not feeding it. When she was done, Andrew sat with me by the small window. The sky had gone the color of paper, and the parking lot lights clicked on in a sequence that felt ceremonial. He said, "I have been so tired, Mom. I thought it was the hours." I was ashamed to say it out loud. I told him the shame was not his to carry. Weariness is not a sin. Trust is not a sin either. Only those who take advantage of it have to answer for anything. The intercom crackled, and a page called Dr. Caldwell to the lab. He rose and looked at me. "Stay with him," he said. "I will bring you what we can have today." He left with the bag in his hand, and for a moment I was alone with Andrew and the sound of my own pulse in my ear. It did not race. It pounded with a deliberate rhythm like a fist on a door. I counted again. 1, 2, 3. I found my breath each time. In the quiet, I let myself remember Grace without anger, so that the anger when it arrived would be clean. The first dinner after their wedding, when she came early to help me set the table, and she told me she had never felt so welcomed by a mother in her life. The afternoon she stopped by with peonies and asked me for my favorite childhood recipe and took notes with the focus of a student. The morning she stood in my kitchen with sleeves rolled and whisked eggs, while Andrew laughed at something on his phone. How easily we mistake performance for devotion when we want to be loved. How faithfully a mask will hold if no one touches it. Footsteps returned down the corridor. Caldwell's silhouette first, then the slow appearance of his face in the doorway. He did not carry the bag anymore. He had left it where light and instruments could tell the story better than we could. He glanced at Andrew, then at me, and his look said only this: "We are moving. Do not stop now." I stood. The air in the room lifted just enough to let me breathe all the way to the bottom of my lungs. "We will wait for the first pass," he said, and then he lowered his voice so only I could hear. "If what I suspect is confirmed, we follow the line up the chain. We keep our mouths closed." We let the facts speak. I nodded and put a hand on Andrew's arm. He turned his palm up, and our fingers met the way they did when he was a boy, and a thunderstorm made the windows rattle. The same storm had come back, only now it was inside the house. Down the hall, a cart squeaked. Somewhere, a child laughed in a different room. Life continued with its indifferent rhythm, and in that rhythm, I felt something settle in me that was not rage and not fear. It was an intention. It was the hinge between trust and vigilance. I would not become a woman who shouted at shadows. I would become the woman who stands still enough for the truth to walk toward her. The powder on that lid had tried to look like kindness. It had tried to hide inside domestic light. It had met a boundary. In my head, the spoon hit the tile again, and then the sound changed. It became the steady bass of a heart monitor. I let the two sounds braid into one until they felt like a metronome. Time marked itself. Breath followed. Outside the window, dusk brushed the parking lot in a thin gray veil. I looked at my son, and then at the doorway where the next moment would enter. Blind trust is a beautiful room, I thought. It is also the shortest hallway to a disaster. I closed my eyes and waited for the door to open. Grace moved through my kitchen like a dancer, every move rehearsed to perfection. The kettle breathed just before it sang, and she was already lifting it off the flame the way a violinist anticipates the note. Steam curled around her wrists. She chose 2 cups from the open shelf without looking as if her hands knew the cupboard better than I did. One cup had a hairline crack so fine you needed light to find it. She set that one in front of me and smiled as if she had just given me a small white flower. Andrew was late that Sunday. The markets had kept him, and Grace had arrived early with a paper bag and a story about parking that made me laugh. She unwrapped 2 lemon scones and brushed the crumbs from the counter with a folded napkin as if disorder made her skin itch. I watched her. I wanted to love what my son loved, and it was easy. Her laugh had a bell in it. Her posture made you sit straighter. She knew how to ask about my week in a way that gave back the time you spent answering. "Your blends could live forever, Margaret," she murmured while she poured. The tea streamed like silk. She remarked on how scent anchors memory and how our little brand had found a loyal audience because I never cut corners. She cradled her cup and noted that devotion at scale becomes legacy. The words were warm. The cup in my hands was warm. I sipped and found a bitter edge under the amber and let it linger on my tongue until it named itself. This was the new Assam we had been testing, and the leaves had oversteeped. A small thing, a signal all the same. I set the cup down and let my fingertips rest on the saucer the way you steady a book that wants to slide from your lap. I remember the first time Andrew brought her through that door. The house inhaled her perfume, a clean floral I could pick apart note by note and still feel enchanted by the blend. She had remembered something he told her in passing and brought me a tiny jar of sea salt she had found at a weekend market because I love roasting winter squash. She had asked about my earliest candle experiments and listened like a student who had already decided on her thesis. She laughed at my story about a wick that refused to center and about the ceiling stain I still had not painted over. When she left, I stood in the quiet and smiled and told the dining room air that my boy had chosen a good woman. Later, when we took a Sunday walk down to the little shop on Hawthorne where I used to sell our first batches, she reached for my arm when we crossed the street and told me she admired women who build reputations out of late nights and burn scars. She asked for nothing. She only drew pictures in the air of what a future could look like if a brand like ours found a second wind. Her career in PR had taught her to think in arcs and campaigns, and I listened because I like learning from younger eyes. She had this way of standing slightly to the side of a compliment and letting it land as if she had not thrown it. It left very little room for suspicion. She had another habit, too. She liked to rearrange my cupboards in little ways she could justify. The honey moved one shelf over because light hardens it. The mugs formed a new gradient because the color pleases the morning. I went along because none of it mattered. The house felt fresher for it. My habits softened around her, and the kitchen wore her palms like a blessing. That winter, she found a vintage tin at the thrift store with my initials in looping script and presented it to me with apple cheeks. I used it for the loose teas because I wanted to honor her attention. Even now, the tin sits there on the shelf, the metal catching light that changes every hour and somehow keeps its own stern smile. The first time she made me tea alone, the clock on the wall marked steady time, and the house held its breath as if impressed by her competence. She moved like someone who had practiced being welcomed. She asked me about my childhood kitchen, and I told her about my mother's iron skillet that weighed as much as a suitcase. She told me about the cramped apartment where she grew up, 2 doors down from the corner bar where laughter sloshed down the stairs on Fridays. She confided that she wanted a family that believed in quiet rituals and that my house made her feel forgiven for things she had not done. I felt protective then, not just of Andrew, but of her too. I could be that kind of mother-in-law, I thought, the generous one, the steady harbor. It is easy to mistake a plea for belonging for the outline of a heart. She folded our talk back into the tea. "Your blends could live forever, Margaret," she repeated softly, as if the line were a refrain and not a thought she had placed on the table. I lifted my cup and answered that things that live forever often lose their scent. It was a joke on the surface and a caution under the surface, and she laughed the bright, quick way she laughed when she was pretending to disagree. She said legacy does not have to be static. She could help polish the story. She could introduce the brand to friends who love what lasts. I nodded because she had ideas and excitement, and because my son loved a woman with a plan. I noticed other little things and filed them along with recipe cards and warranty papers. She preferred cashmere to wool because it photographs better. She tilted the mirrors a degree to catch more light. She plated food like a stylist and slid her phone across the edge of the plate as if dinner without a picture might not quite exist. She planned a community event at our shop for a local shelter and posted a careful caption that made her the bridge between the cause and the brand. When the donations came in, I hugged her and meant it. Goodness replicated is still goodness, even if it looks pretty on a feed. One Thursday evening, when Andrew worked late, she brought over a folder with mock-ups for refreshed labels. She had borrowed a designer friend, and they had moved the font from serif to humanist and softened the palette to allude to sea glass. It was lovely. It meant work. It meant growth. She asked me if I could imagine stepping back from production to focus on storytelling. The question floated there like steam in winter. I said I could imagine many things. She smiled and set down her cup and traced the edge of the saucer, as if outlining a map. The kettle clicked again. The room ticked with it. She remarked that when a brand reaches a certain age, investors begin to view it less as a small business and more as a house of meaning. She had always wanted to be part of a house like that, she murmured. She noted how lucky Andrew was to have a mother whose work could outlive her. She waited before she added the line that pushed the rhythm from lullaby into something brighter. "When you retire, who will inherit the company?" The way she said retire made my name feel old. It was not an accusation. It was more like a key testing a lock. I looked at the hairline crack on my cup. Light found it and turned it into a river. I asked her why she wondered. She told me she was thinking long-term because planning is love in the future tense. She had seen families shatter under ambiguity, and she did not want that for us. She could help me set up a transition. She could learn the formulas. She could protect what I had built. She spoke very gently. She had done this talk before, I thought. Not with me, with the world. I rinsed the cups and let the water run over my wrists until my pulse slowed. The bitter edge in the tea had faded, but it had not vanished. I dried the cups and set them upside down on the towel, and when I turned back, she was looking at my hands the way one looks at an instrument one plans to inherit. I told her I had a lawyer who kept papers that could change in a day, and that Andrew knew as much as he needed to know for now. She nodded, and the nod was careful. She murmured that uncertainty invites outsiders, and I should keep everything within the family. I said we will. She stood and drifted to the window and watched rain knead the street. She admired the view and said Portland teaches you patience. She noted that patience is a kind of capital. She asked if I ever thought of moving the shop closer to the water to capture the tourists who come for the coastline. I told her the river had always been enough for me. The ocean is beautiful, but it can swallow you. She laughed as if I had made a rare joke. I did not laugh. When Andrew finally came in, damp from the bus and grateful for the warmth, she moved to him like the second half of a sentence that knows its predicate. They shared a look that reminded me of the first spring he brought home a stray cat and begged to keep it. Open heart, quick joy. He hugged me and apologized for the hour. We ate the dinner Grace had prepared earlier, and she told him about the label mock-ups, and he praised her taste. I watched them from the head of the table and let my eyes rest the way you rest your eyes between stitches so you do not pierce the wrong place. After they left, I washed the cups again as if rinsing away a thought. The clock on the wall ticked with the serenity of an old metronome. Between the ticks, the house was so quiet I could hear my own breath. Admiration fills a room quickly. It takes longer to notice whether it has dark corners. I dried my hands and stood back, and looked at the shelf where the cups lived. The cracked one belonged to my mother. She used to pour black tea and insist I sweeten it myself. "Know what you are swallowing," she would say, without looking up from her ledger. I ran a thumb over the line of the crack and felt it as a ridge. In the weeks that followed, Grace became a fixture in the shop. Customers warmed to her, and she warmed right back with the kind of focus that feels like a gift. She learned which scent sells in the rain and which in the heat. She murmured the story of each blend like a prayer. She noted which regulars asked for discounts and which ones rounded up at the register. She never mishandled cash. She never left fingerprints where reputation could see them. If there was calculation in her, I could not find it then. Maybe I did not want to. Want is a kind of blindfold. In the evening, I offered her the key to the stockroom while Andrew and I took inventory, and she accepted as though it were a piece of candy you hand a child to keep them busy during a long drive. She placed it on her palm and admired its weight. She slid it onto her key ring, where it found its place between her car fob and a tiny lighthouse charm. She told me she loved lighthouses because they do not argue with storms or fog, they merely hold light. I told her light can also be blinding if you stare straight into it. She smiled and let the comment float. The kettle cooled. The clock ticked. I stood by the open door and listened to the rain ease into mist. Somewhere, a distant horn sounded on the river, and then the sound folded into the softer hush that comes when water meets water. I leaned my shoulder against the frame and let the day drain out of my bones. My house has always matched the weather like a loyal dog. That night, it wore patience over doubt and called it peace. When I closed my eyes, I could hear the slow, steady breath of the ocean beyond the river, a sound that arrives late and stays long, the way time does when it wants to be noticed. The word arsenic sliced through the sterile air like glass. It did not come shouted. It arrived flat and precise as if the syllables wore gloves. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hymn above us, and the room shrank to a chair, a table, my son's arm, and the narrow silver of a needle tray. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart squeaked, and then the sound fell away as if it had reached the edge of its own courage. Andrew sat very still, and I could see the muscles in his jaw holding their ground. He had rolled up his sleeve for the third time in an hour, and the elastic of the tourniquet left a thin bracelet on his skin. The nurse moved with practiced grace, the way people move when their hands have memorized danger and respect in the same motion. She cleaned a small patch on his arm with a swab, and the cool scent rose like a reminder that clarity stings first. The needle glinted once and slid in. I watched the vial darken as it filled, and I felt something leak out of my chest at the same pace. Fear, I suppose, or the illusion that I had been watching closely all along. "Someone's been feeding him death in teaspoons," Dr. Caldwell said. He did not look at me when he said it. He watched the second vial click into place, and then he lifted his eyes to Andrew gently, as if the sentence should land on a man and not on his mother. I heard my own breath answer before my mouth did, and I served it on trust. The words left me without argument and sat between us like a fourth chair no one wanted to acknowledge. The nurse removed the needle and pressed gauze to Andrew's arm. "Hold this," she murmured. He obeyed. She taped the little square into place, and the white against his skin startled me with its purity. Dr. Caldwell thanked her with a nod and led us to a small consultation room where the hum of the light sounded louder and closer, as if truth wanted to be sure it had our attention. He kept his voice even. "We will look for patterns," he said. "Blood, urine, if possible, a hair sample. Chronic exposure leaves a signature that does not lie. Andrew reached up and tugged 2 hairs free with a wince and a grim smile. He placed them into the envelope the nurse held ready. He said, "I am fine." It was the sort of sentence men are taught to say when they want to protect the woman in the room from the size of the news. I let it pass through me and settle where it would. Fine would have to wait its turn. Dr. Caldwell excused himself to the lab and left the door mostly closed. The room was suddenly too bright, and the chairs too narrow. I folded my hands and studied the furrows time had carved across my knuckles. They looked like riverbeds after a drought. Andrew leaned back and stared at the ceiling, as if numbers might appear there to comfort him. He said I kept thinking it was the hours, the screens, the clients. I told him that tiredness is not a moral failing and the body never lies for long. He let out a breath and nodded and closed his eyes for a count that I matched without meaning to. 1, 2, there was nothing else to do. Silence entered then, not the awkward kind, the kind that lets a room reset its bones. I counted the blinks of the fluorescents and thought about the lists on my refrigerator door at home. Get cinnamon sticks. Replace the wicks. Call the plumber about the hissing beneath the sink. I added a new line in my mind, and it wrote itself with a heavy hand. Find the source. Guard the boy. It sounded like a prayer because it was one. A woman in green scrubs brought us paper cups of water and placed them on the table with the care of someone offering vessels at an altar. Andrew said thank you, and I watched his fingers shake almost imperceptibly when he lifted the rim to his mouth. He set the cup down and stared at the ring it left. He said, I have been nauseated off and on for weeks. Thought it was coffee. Thought it was nerves. On Tuesday, I felt pins in my fingers. On Friday, I saw dots in my vision and blamed the screen. He rubbed his chest absently and stopped when he saw me looking. His expression softened. I did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say until light arrived with its ledger. Footsteps outside. A pause. Dr. Caldwell returned with a folder that was not thick enough to end a nightmare but thick enough to begin one. He sat and rested the folder on his knee, like a man testing the weight of a story. Preliminary only, he said. The blood panel shows traces that align with what I feared. The urine agrees. He tapped the top corner with one finger, then looked up. The hair will take a little longer, but if it tells the same tale, we are dealing with accumulation. Low dose over time. He did not continue because there was no need. The word accumulation struck me harder than arsenic had. Accumulation meant routine. It meant a hand that did not shake. It meant repetition disguised as care. I pictured mornings unspooling like ribbon. Lunch containers lined in a neat row. A bowl placed with the kind of love that needs no applause. Vision is the cruelest when it arrives late. It replays ordinary scenes with their costumes ripped away. I felt anger rise like heat at the base of my neck, and I let it rise just enough to keep me standing. Rage is an accelerant. I would need something steadier than that. Andrew swallowed and said, What happens next? Dr. Caldwell laid the folder flat and rested both palms on it as if to keep the facts from sliding. Quiet steps, he said. You will eat only what you prepare or what your mother hands you. You will mention this to no one. We will repeat tests under coded orders at intervals to track the decline in levels. If we are careful, the body will clear what it can. He paused and then added in the tone of a man who has learned to leave room for grief. You should feel better if the source is removed. The word source hovered between us like a moth repeatedly striking a light. I asked about symptoms, and he answered in the steady cadence of instruction that carries a bitter mercy. Fatigue. Stomach pain. Headaches. Neuropathy. Skin changes. He let the list be itself, and then he folded it back into silence. He looked at me because he knew what I would ask. No, you did not miss what you should have seen, he said before I could speak. Habit blinds the careful faster than malice blinds the foolish. He had a gift for pulling shame out from under a patient and shaking it free like dust from a rug. I nodded and felt the smallest piece of myself reattached to the rest. Andrew stood and paced 2 steps and then sat again like a man who has just learned the deck beneath him moves. He rubbed his face and let his hands fall. He said this changes everything. He did not say her name, neither did I. Words have gravity, and naming too early can pull a situation into the wrong orbit. I touched the back of his hand the way I did when he was 6, and too proud to cry about a skinned knee. We will walk with facts, I said. We will take steps, not guesses. Dr. Caldwell gathered the vials and the form the way a conductor gathers a piece when the orchestra has found its tempo. He spoke like a colleague again, like the nights long ago when we mapped poisons we could not see. "I will file the codes," he said. "We will move samples with discretion. If anyone calls asking questions, you will refer them to me." He glanced at Andrew. "You will go home now. You will pretend to be exactly as you were yesterday, except you will carry your food in from the outside." He paused. "Do not fear your kitchen. Just choose what touches your plate." The way he said choose felt like a hand on my spine. We stepped back into the corridor, and the lights greeted us with the same hum as if they had always known. The unit had its own weather, and it did not change for us. Another patient laughed down the hall, a sound that came from a throat that had not been offered a teaspoon of anything but joy. The monitor in the room next door kept its measured beep, and I listened to it until my heartbeat fell in with it. The lift opened and closed and opened again. We moved like figures on a slow conveyor toward what had to be done. At the reception, a clerk printed a slip and handed it over with eyes that understood how to be a witness without becoming a story. Andrew slid the paper into his pocket and thanked her, and I watched his shoulders square themselves a fraction. He had inherited his father's quiet spine. The thought both steadied and hurt me. Grief never leaves. It just changes rooms when you stop looking. I blinked, and the present returned without apology. Outside the clinic, the light had shifted, and the day wore a gray that made shapes look honest. I pulled my scarf tighter, and Andrew tucked his chin into his collar like a boy. We walked to the car in silence. 2 spaces over, a young couple argued softly about a car seat while their baby slept through it. I felt the absurd tenderness of wanting to warn them about everything and nothing at once. Live kindly, I thought. Pay relentless attention. Refuse easy explanations for anything that matters. In the car, Andrew said, "What if I have already said too much to her about how I feel?" He stared through the windshield, and his voice had the thinness of paper that has been folded and unfolded too many times. I told him feelings are not confessions. Illness is not a courtroom. He nodded and exhaled and closed his eyes for 3 slow counts. We agreed to meet at my house in an hour. I would make soup from what I could see with my own eyes and cut the bread at angles my mother would approve of. He smiled at that tiny detail, and the smile put a crack through the gray. We drove away, and the unit's glow receded in the rearview mirror. The traffic lights blinked their steady code, and I obeyed without thinking, as if obedience itself could return the world to its right axis. At a red light, my phone vibrated. A message from Grace appeared on the screen. A simple line asking how the afternoon had gone and if Andrew wanted her to bring dinner to the office. My chest tightened like a fist and then relaxed. Not yet, I told myself. Not a word yet. The line between suspicion and certainty is thin and sacred. Step on it and it breaks. Back home, I rinsed a pot and set it on the burner, and the mundane act felt like a protest against chaos. I chopped onions and felt the sweet sting travel up into my eyes, where tears had been threatening to gather anyway. I listened to the knife on the board, the firm pop of the lid as I opened tomatoes, the dignified hiss when broth met heat. The kitchen held me as it always had. What we choose to touch matters. What we choose to hand to those we love matters more. When Andrew arrived, he came in without knocking, the way children do, even when they are grown. He washed his hands and slid into the chair by the window and watched the steam lift. He ate slowly and said very little, and each time he set the spoon down, I felt gratitude as raw as a new wound. After he left with the containers I had filled in front of him, I stood at the sink and stared at the dark glass. My reflection looked like a woman who had been told a true thing at last and now had to carry it with both arms. In the quiet, the memory of the monitor's steady beep rose in my ears, and then something softer layered over it. The first drops met the sill like polite visitors. Then the rhythm settled into a sheet of sound, and the window fogged with its own breath. Rain. It ran down the pane in slender paths that caught the streetlight and turned it to threads. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. Love is not blind, I thought. It only wears a habit as a veil. Outside, the world rinsed itself clean in slow motion, and I let that sound carry me from the hard light of the ward back into the night that waits when you finally begin to see. In one paragraph of legal ink, I found the reason my son might die. The sentence was not long. It lived near the bottom of a page where most eyes would be tired. The paper smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil, and the letters were so careful they looked kind. Harlan Keene slid the folder toward me and waited while I read. My thumb rested on the margin to steady the page, the way you steady a truth you do not want to learn. The clause said what such clauses always say in language that pretends to be neutral. If Andrew does not survive the distribution date, his spouse becomes the sole taker of his portion and attached rights. It was a neat pivot, a door that swings silently when one life ends. I traced the line with my eyes again, and the words did not change. A second line reflected the first across the estate plan for my company shares. If the primary beneficiary predeceases the settler, the surviving spouse receives full control, subject to ordinary probate. There it was, no villains on the page, only a path. Harlan sat behind his desk in a suit that had been brushed and repaired more than once. He kept a fountain pen uncapped beside a blotter, and the nib shone like a small blade. The room had tall windows and books that had been opened so often their spines bowed to the reader. He cleared his throat softly. "You signed this after your husband died," he said. "You wanted to honor a family you had not yet met. You wrote a kind future on paper. The law does not dislike kindness. It just does not protect it from strategy. The law does not kill people using it," I said. The words came out level. I did not raise my voice. I would not give the page that power. He studied me for a heartbeat, and then leaned forward. "Then rewrite your law before she rewrites your life," he said. He did not say grace. He did not need to. He asked me to tell him the timeline without adding heat. I told him I would never accuse without proof. I told him about the container that glittered, and about Caldwell's hands, and about the preliminary results that already had their own gravity. I told him how tired my son had been, and how I had not connected what should have been connected. I did not cry. The fluorescent light of the clinic still lived in my throat and kept me dry and clear. Harlan nodded slowly. "We will act as if facts are our only witnesses," he said. "First, we remove the hinge." He tapped the page with the back of his pen. "We draft a codicil and a restatement. We end the survivorship effect as it concerns your line. We route your business interest to a trust with you, as trustee, and with named successors who are not your daughter-in-law. We set a separate letter of intent for charitable uses. We adjust Andrew's beneficiary designations on accounts that allow changes now." He paused. "We do this quietly. You tell no one until the ink is dry." I watched the pen nib catch light, power and consequence in the same stroke. He asked about timing, and I asked him what timing exists when a sentence on a page has already invited fate to sit at your table. He said hours, not days. My palms warmed and cooled like they could not decide what season it was. I thought of my mother's ledger and how she used to tuck a ribbon between pages to mark a debt that had to be settled before sundown. My debt right now was to clarity. He pulled a clean set of forms from a drawer and began writing in block letters so plain they could not be misunderstood. He asked me to confirm names and percentages and the destination of residual assets if Andrew should predecease me. The phrase predecease felt like a stone in the mouth, and I swallowed around it and answered. I named a trustee who had spent her career doing boring good. I listed 2 nieces who would never expect a windfall. I shaped a fund for women whose homes are not safe. I heard the scratch of the pen and felt a piece of the room exhale. We moved to the company. He suggested a governance change that could be filed within 48 hours. I signed under a temporary board resolution that made it harder to replace than a paragraph in an old will. He prepared a separate memorandum about access and controls, key custody, inventory logs, vendor permissions, small fences that stop opportunists who rely on your gentle habits. He looked up often to be sure I was with him. I was. He told me to call my financial institution and request immediate updates on transfer on death designations. He offered to place the calls from his office so the administrative staff would hear a lawyer's cadence and not a worried mother's breath. We did it. I spelled names and numbers in a voice that did not shake. Each confirmation number felt like a nail driven into a frame that had been loosening. He explained that none of these accused anyone of anything. Paper cannot accuse. It only instructs. We were changing instructions. If someone expects to step into a role by timing a tragedy, the door will now open onto emptiness. He said it without malice. He has been a lawyer too long to need malice. He told me to add one more small circuit breaker. A clause that says any person who contests in bad faith takes nothing. It is a simple sentence with sharp teeth. I agreed. I felt the teeth and welcomed them. He printed a codicil and an amendment and laid them side by side on the blotter. He slid the pen toward me. It looked heavier than before. I took it and tested the flow on the blotter, and a black line appeared clean as a musical staff. My hand hovered over my name, and in that pause I saw two scenes as if an old projector had turned on at the corner of my eye. Grace in my kitchen, moving like choreography. Andrew, as a boy writing his name on a school permission slip with such care that he made each letter a promise. I set the nib down and signed where he indicated. The sound of the pen on paper was soft but final. Now, witnesses, Harlan said. He called in two paralegals who stood with the calm of people who watch signatures every day and understand their weather. They signed and dated. The pen clicked when it capped, and the sound ran through me like the lock of a door. Harlan placed the documents into a sealed envelope and handed me a duplicate to keep off sight. He used phrases like chain of custody and notarized duplicate, and I repeated them in my head until they held. He folded his hands and gave me the next steps in a voice that made lists feel like blankets. He would file what had to be filed. He would courier what could not wait. I would go home and make dinner for my son with my own hands, and I would sleep with the documents under a book on my nightstand until he sent a runner with the final stamped copies. "We will not announce," he said. "We will not provoke. We will let silence do the work of a wall." I said, "Tell me what to say if anyone asks why I was here." He smiled without warmth. "Say you are updating beneficiary forms for a small donation," he said. "Say you are putting your company in a trust to simplify administration as you age. Both are true. Truth layered on truth becomes its own disguise." He slid a card toward me with an emergency number handwritten along the bottom. "If a storm comes," he said, "call this line. Paper holds, but people panic, and we will not." I stood and thanked him, and he reached for the door before I could. His office smelled like oiled wood and patience. In the hallway, the carpet dulled our steps, and the window at the end framed a stripe of winter sky. He walked with me to the elevator and pressed the button. The metal doors slid open, and we stood together a moment in the mechanical hush. He said one more thing. "Do not let her see you change how you move. Ritual is a mask. Leave yours on until we are ready." The elevator doors closed, and I descended with the envelope held close against my coat. I could feel the weight of the signature through the paper as if ink had mass. On the ground floor, the lobby's marble gave back my footfalls in a polite echo. I crossed to the street, and the city met me with its ordinary face. A cyclist glided past. A woman in a yellow raincoat juggled a bag and a phone and a coffee and did not spill any of them. Normal life went on, only now a paragraph no longer threatened to turn it into a headline. At home, I set the envelope in a drawer that holds warranties and passports and the kinds of papers you reach for when a siren stops outside your house. I lit a candle not out of habit but ceremony. The lighter clicked, and the flame drew a clean cone and then softened into its work. The room breathed the first rise of scent, bergamot and cedar, and the faint shadow of smoke. I sat at the table with a pad and made another list. Call Andrew at 9 to confirm food for tomorrow, replace locks on the shop office, move petty cash to the bank before closing, speak to Detective Nora in the morning about the safest way to gather what we still need. When the list was done, I wrote a single line under it and let my hand rest there. When power is placed in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon. Today I took one weapon away. Tomorrow I will start counting the rest. The candle's small flame kept its quiet grammar, and I let it speak. I heard the pen again in my memory, and then a steadier sound rose under it. The pulse in my throat had found time again. I breathed with it. Outside, the light lowered itself over the river, and the windows on the west side of the street turned to sheets of copper. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor turned on a radio and a song threaded the air thin as a wire. I closed the drawer and laid my palm on the wood. Paper cannot accuse. It can protect. Tonight, that was enough. I learned long ago that if you want to catch a liar, offer them what they crave. The thought arrived as clean as a blade, and I felt the room tilt toward usefulness. Morning light slid across my kitchen table and stopped at the candle I had not yet lit. I turned the lighter over in my palm and listened to its small weight. Fire clarifies. It refuses confusion. I called Detective Nora Quinn because I wanted that kind of honesty in the room. She met me at the back table of a quiet coffee shop near the river, where the floorboards kept secrets and the barista kept her eyes on the cups. Nora wore a navy coat that looked practical and expensive at the same time. She moved like someone who had stood in too many doorways waiting for truth to run out of places to hide. We exchanged a few soft words about the rain, then she leaned in and asked me to tell her everything from the day the lunchbox glittered to last night's soup placed on my counter under my own hands. I gave her the timeline. I kept heat out of my voice so the facts could breathe. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she rested her elbows on the table and let a beat pass. Then she smiled without showing teeth. "Let her think you are burning your fortune away," she said. "Announce nothing on paper and everything in a way she can overhear. If greed is sitting at your table, it will reach for the largest plate." I thought of the envelope in my drawer and of Harlan Keene's pen, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a lock that has already been changed. "She will light her own fuse," I said. Nora nodded. "She will, and you will not flinch. We will need a genuine performance and some small shutters in place in case she moves faster than we expect." Nora suggested a simple arrangement. I would schedule a meeting at my house with a philanthropic advisor whose job is to help donors translate grief into good. I would leave a doorway open and a sentence wandering. I would mention an 80% gift and a date a month from now when papers might be signed. I would place a thick folder of blank drafts on the table where a passerby could mistake volume for certainty. No accusations. Just a story that invites haste. Meanwhile, Nora would step quietly into the edges of our days. A small microphone could live in a ceramic jar near the stove. A camera no larger than a thimble might nestle in the crown of the pantry molding. "Not today," she said. "Not until the bait is taken. First, we coax her closer to the edge, where she will do our work for us." I agreed, and we set the time. The coffee shop door opened and closed, and I watched the river press its winter shoulder against the pilings. I asked Nora what I should be in this play. She said to be the mother who learned how to measure patience the way you measure fragrance by note and weight. Do not tremble, do not rush. The guilty do that for you. Back home, I cleared the dining table of everything that told the story of an ordinary week, and I placed a new legal pad exactly in the center as if precision lived here. I brewed a pot of tea and warmed 2 cups, and brought out our bergamot and cedar candle because the room needed a witness. When I flicked the lighter, the sound was small and decisive. A tongue of flame took, and then settled into its own grammar. The lift of scent made the house look taller. I called a woman named Alana Pierce, who helps build shelters and scholarships. We had met once at an event where Grace showed up with checklists and budgets and a quiet boardroom vote. I told her I wanted counsel about channeling a significant gift, and that I needed discretion. She said discretion is the only language that counts in this kind of work. We set an afternoon. I texted Andrew a simple note, confirming he would pick up dinner from me again. He sent a heart and a thumbs up, and a third small emblem that looked like a shield. I did not have to tell Grace about the meeting. Houses speak even when you ask them not to. She walked in that day with a bunch of tulips and a story about a client meltdown, and set the flowers in the sink as if she were soothing a child. Then she saw the legal pad. Her gaze slowed and then sped back up. She asked if we were hosting someone. I told her I was exploring a charitable idea that had been on my mind since autumn. She lifted her shoulders the way one does when a thought is too light to carry, and said philanthropy gives the brand a halo. She picked up the candle and read the label with rehearsed fondness. She remarked that our best-selling scent was a ready metaphor, light that lasts. Alana arrived with a leather folder and a pen that clicked in 3 languages. We sat at the table and let words like endowment and restricted funds and governance drift into the air where anyone in the hallway could gather them. Alana asked about intent and timing. I told her I wanted most of my business proceeds to feed a foundation for women who need a door that locks from the inside. I kept my face soft, but my numbers were not soft. I said 80% in a first wave, and perhaps more later, and Alana wrote without swallowing. She recommended the kind of entity that ages well. We talked about matching gifts. We talked about timelines. We did not talk about fear because the work of the meeting was to give fear a calendar. Halfway through the conversation, Grace crossed the threshold of the dining room on her way to the backyard with her phone pressed to her ear. She smiled and mimed an apology and kept moving. The smile did not reach her eyes. When the sliding door closed behind her, I could still hear the cadence of her voice. The rhythm rose and fell and then flattened into a thread of sound that suggested urgency spoken through clenched teeth. Alana continued to lay out options. She praised as if she were blessing a chapel that did not yet exist. I asked whether a month was a realistic horizon. She said a month is forever if one knows where one is going. When Alana left, she walked down the front steps with her folder held to her chest, like a book worth finishing. I thanked her and watched her car merge into the street's patient river. Behind me, I heard the soft press of feet on the hallway runner. Grace stood there with a dish towel in her hands, twisted into a rope. She asked gentle questions. What would a gift like that mean for family ownership? Who would shepherd the brand if I were absent in the day-to-day? I answered with the composure of a woman who has given this thought for months. A gift changes the kind of stewardship needed. It invites a different timeline. It does not erase what came before. She nodded as if the words were poetry and not a warning. She said the right donors transform cities. She said she loved being part of a story that outlives the people inside it. After dinner, I returned to the table alone and let the candle burn down to a clear pool. The house kept the memory of Alana's pen strokes and Grace's quick steps, and the sliding door shutting on the sound of a voice that did not want to be overheard. I set the lighter beside the legal pad and listened to the tiny tick of cooling glass. Then I walked to the living room and took my mother's clock off the mantel. It is a brass carriage clock with a key that lives tucked into the felt at its base. I turned the key slowly. The spring tightened with a polite complaint. The clock's heart began to speak again. Each talk felt like a nail set into wood. The arrangement had begun. Now, time had a job. The next day, Nora met me near the shop under the awning where our deliveryman leaves boxes when it rains. She wore a bright scarf that made the gray seem temporary. She asked what Grace had done after Alana left. I told her she toured the house with her phone at her ear again, and that the tension in her shoulders made a right angle in the air. Nora considered this and said, "Then we move the shutters into place tonight." She handed me a plain paper bag with 2 small devices inside. She explained them with the calm of a teacher who believes in her students. A ceramic jar in my kitchen would hold a small ear. A molding above the pantry door would hold a small eye. She told me where to place them so they would live like dust. She did not ask me to look at the footage later. She said she and her team would watch. She would translate when necessary. She did not want me to search for cruelty where I had once set a table. She would do that part. As we spoke, I watched Grace through the shop window. She was helping a customer choose a gift, and she did it with the grace of a woman offering a shawl to someone who has just learned the word widow. She wrote a note card with slow loops, and the customer left with softened shoulders. Grace turned to the sink and rinsed a small pitcher. She wound a dish towel into that same rope. Habit tells us more reliably than confession. Nora touched my forearm to bring me back. There was no drama in the gesture, just the transfer of steadiness. She said, "Keep your routines. Announce a family dinner for Friday. Arrange a meeting with your lawyer again, and let Grace hear you say the word foundation in a sentence with the word final. Do this with the casualness of weather. Make it sound as if the calendar turned the page all by itself." I said I could do that. I did not have to pretend. A mother can set a table and keep a vigil at the same time. That evening, I set the devices where they should sleep. The ceramic jar near the stove had always held wooden spoons. It accepted the extra passenger without protest. The pantry molding wore the other device like a shadow. I stood on a stool and pressed it into place and stepped down, and blinked into the light. The kitchen looked like itself. My hands looked older on the counter than they had yesterday. I reached for the lighter and touched flame to a wick. The candle caught, and the room took its first small breath again. It smelled like citrus and cedar and the memory of fire. Grace came by with a jar of soup and a smile that knew its lines. She placed the container on the counter and asked how the meeting had gone. I thanked her for the soup and told her I would reheat it tomorrow. I said Alana had given me a clear path. I said the end of next month looked right for signatures and press and a small reception at the shop. She stood very still and then moved very fast. She complimented my earrings. She laughed at a joke I had not made. She took her phone out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as if to free a signal. She told me she would bring a friend on Friday to talk about ideas for new outreach. Then she turned so quickly that the soup jar rattled against the counter. The house recorded nothing of the air, but I felt it shift anyway. When she left, I wound the clock again even though it did not need it. The key turned with that same polite protest. I held it a moment and then slid it back into its hollow. Wisdom is a weapon when it is aimed at the right target with steady hands. I cleaned the counter. I labeled a new container. I wrote a line on my pad. Friday dinner, foundation final. I underlined the word final and capped my pen. In the quiet that followed, the candle's flame steadied into a small, unwavering column. The tick of the clock fell into step with my breathing. Outside, the river moved like a sheet of dark silk. Inside the house, everything I loved stayed in its place, and everything I feared drifted closer to the light that would not look away. Her expression wobbled the moment I mentioned Charity. It was slight the way the surface of red wine trembles when a table is nudged. If I had blinked, I would have missed it. Andrew set his briefcase by the door and washed his hands in the kitchen like a man who had learned to trust ritual. Grace hovered at the island with polished ease, arranging napkins in a fan as if a small performance could bless the evening. I lifted the bottle and let the stream find the bowl of her glass first. The pour made a velvet sound. The candle on the table burned with a steady core and threw a warm ellipse across the plates. For a stretch of moments, nothing in the room admitted the existence of fear. Not the roast in the oven, not the bread cooling beneath a linen towel, not even the tulips Grace had brought with their bright open faces. Calm can behave like a disguise. It fits everyone until someone says the wrong word. I placed a carafe of water within Andrew's easy reach and rested my palm on his shoulder long enough to feel the solid answer of muscle under cotton. He looked better than yesterday. His eyes still had a shadow at the edges, but the color had come back to his mouth. He reached for the water, and I watched his hand steady itself like a small victory. He would eat from the dishes I had prepared while Grace occupied herself with everything else. This is how you survive a storm without telling the storm it is real. You set knives softly. You choose your bowls. You decide which hand passes what to whom. Grace asked about my day with the kind of brightness that leaves no darkness for a reply to hide in. She admired the linen. She complimented the new label mock-ups as if they had already entered the world and won a prize. She drifted to the hutch and touched the silver as if it needed reassurance. She circled back to the table and lifted her glass to the candlelight and remarked that our best sellers deserved a philanthropic sibling, a fund with a name as elegant as a ribbon. I let the moment hold her voice. Then I spoke about the meeting with Alana Pierce and a plan to direct most of the company's proceeds toward a foundation for women who need doors that lock from the inside. The word most did the work I hoped it would. Her grin held just a fraction too long. Something small stiffened along her jaw and smoothed itself. She recovered with a polished nod, and I admired the discipline. People who train their faces are rarely careless with their steps. She said she adored meaningful giving and how it lifts a brand into the realm of story. She raised her glass a second time, and the Cabernet flashed like a garnet. She held my gaze. "You cannot buy legacy with pity," she said. The sentence wore pretty shoes. Underneath, I heard the steel. I set my napkin on my lap. "No," I said, "but I can expose greed with silence." My voice did not rise. It sank the way an anchor sinks until it finds something that will hold. Andrew cleared his throat and reached for the bread. He tore a piece and broke it again and tasted the smallest corner. He looked at me and then at his plate and smiled with that slight crook he had as a boy when he wanted to reassure me that his scraped knees were only stories the pavement told. I ladled soup into his bowl and into mine and left Grace's place empty because she had brought a salad and a small jar of dressing that gleamed like amber. She insisted we try it. I thanked her and placed it on the sideboard and forgot it there on purpose. We ate, and the conversation traveled the safe roads. Andrew talked about a client who had gone quiet and then returned with humility and a new respect for risk. Grace described an event concept to pair scent with music, and I praised the imagination behind it. The candle made a thin tower of light, and the stem of Grace's glass fractured it into crimson shards that climbed and fell with each gesture of her hand. I listened for the small breaks in her performance. They were like hairline cracks in glaze. They do not announce themselves. They wait for heat. After the plates were cleared, I stood to fetch coffee. I brew it old-fashioned in a stovetop pot that makes the kitchen smell like patience. Grace followed me with 2 cups already in her hands. She leaned against the counter and said the foundation sounded impressive. She asked about timing and whether I had a sense of what month the announcement might live in. I kept my back to her and measured grounds. Late next month, I said, if the details behave. She made an approving sound with her mouth that did not travel to her eyes. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she glanced at the screen and winced as if something toothy had caught her. Take it in the garden, I said. The air has finally lost its bite. She thanked me and slipped through the back door. The door clicked closed with a politeness I did not trust. I turned the knob on the coffee and set it to a low flame. Then I took my own phone from my apron pocket and opened the recorder. I moved toward the mudroom that sits between the kitchen and the deck, where the wall vent carries sound down from the eaves. The timber breathes like a throat. I held the device at waist height and let the house be the microphone it was built to be. Her voice reached me as a thread first, then a line, then a wire. We cannot wait another week, she said. The words came out in a whisper that forgot to pretend it was not a command. She paused, and then the consonant sharpened. Papers are shifting. She thinks she can disappear the money into a hole. No, we have to press now. A car passed on the street and masked a few syllables, but the shape of urgency is easy to read even without every letter. The recorder kept its small red eye steady. I could hear the slick tremor of someone on the other end speaking fast. I could hear the winter bamboo touching itself in the wind. I could hear the house exhale, as if it had been waiting to hear what I was hearing. I do not know how long I stood there. Time does something strange when certainty begins to pour. It thickens, it slows, it grows muscle. The coffee pot hissed a soft warning, and I turned off the flame and set it aside. I tapped the screen and watched the file save. I renamed it with the boring code Nora taught me. Date, hour, room. It felt like sliding a jewel into a pocket and pretending it was only a pebble. I returned to the table with the tray and found Andrew watching the back door as if it were a stage and he had missed a line. He let out a breath when he saw me, and his shoulders fell a fraction. Grace came in a moment later with cheeks bright as if the evening air had loved her too hard. She apologized for the interruption and touched Andrew's arm as if to smooth a wrinkle. I poured coffee and offered cream and sugar, and she declined with a warm wave. She asked how a fund like mine might interface with the brand. She asked whether the new direction would require new leadership from within. Her tone had the curiosity of a journalist and the entitlement of a person who had already chosen her seat. The red in her glass had deepened to a black cherry color. When she lifted it, the candle showed through the stem, like a river through obsidian. She tapped the base of the glass with a nail. A tiny, clear note sang, and died. The sound reminded me of a bell in a far chapel. A call to an empty room. I found myself thinking of the phone in her pocket, humming like a living thing. I imagined the words still buzzing there, looking for purchase. Andrew stood to rinse his cup, and I let him. He moved with the deliberate calm of a man whose every step now counts. He set the cup in the rack and dried his hands on a clean towel. He thanked Grace for the flowers. He thanked me for dinner. He promised to call when he reached his apartment. He left early because we had planned that too. He would exit while we could still call the night pleasant and unremarkable. His coat made a whisper against the doorframe. That was the sound of our arrangement wearing its good shoes. Grace lingered and did that thing where she tidied a room to leave her fingerprint on it. She straightened the runner. She adjusted the angle of a framed photo of my husband holding a sparker at a long-ago New Year. She asked if she could bring a new salad to our Friday dinner. She promised to ask a friend with media contacts to stop by. She praised the candle as if it could wash the dark out of a long hallway. When she finally stepped into the night, I followed her to the porch with a sweater around my shoulders. Her car's interior light flicked on and lit her face in a pale square. She sat for a second before starting the engine. Then the door thumped closed. The sound was final enough to enjoy. I stood under the eave listening to the neighborhood breathe. A dog barked twice at nothing. The river kept its low, untroubled hush. I pressed play on the recording and let the line run back across my ear. We cannot wait another week. Even the phone could not drain the calculation out of those words. I saved the file to the private folder and felt the phone vibrate in my palm when Nora's name crawled across the screen. "Are you alone?" she wrote. I answered yes and typed that I had something for her. She told me to meet her around the corner near the empty lot where a food truck sleeps at night. "Bring nothing but the device," she wrote. "Do not hurry. Do not look back." I locked the door behind me and crossed the street with my hands in my coat pockets, as if I were simply looking for air. The night tasted like rain that changed its mind. I found Nora leaning against her car with the engine off and the cabin smelling faintly of eucalyptus. She opened the passenger door with a small gesture, and I slid in. The interior light glowed and then dimmed to a private dusk. I held out the phone and she took it, and her face did not move while she listened. When the line played through, she nodded once and set the device on the console. The sound of the door closing behind me felt like a page turning. "Good," she said. "We will fold this into our stack. Tomorrow we will add a second angle near your living room. The pantry eye sees the kitchen. We will let another little watcher live among your books." She handed me an unremarkable box, no larger than a paperback. Her tone carried no thrill. Only the patience of a person who has trapped more lies than she has told. "Keep still," she said. "Keep polite. Let her haste do our heavy lifting." I swallowed and felt courage settle in me like a weighted blanket. Back inside my house, I rinsed the coffee pot and listened to the faucet's steady arc. I blew out the candle and watched the wick glow like an ember before it darkened. The room looked taller again in the absence of flame. It is strange how a small fire can make a ceiling feel closer. On the table, 2 wine glasses caught the last of the lamplight and held it like a secret they did not plan to share. Red looks like warmth until you look long enough to see the chill inside it. I washed the glasses slowly and set them upside down on a towel. The drops ran toward the stems like tiny pilgrims and paused there. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a light wind moved the bamboo. Inside, a phone held a sentence that would change the week. Deceit erases itself sooner when someone else refuses to raise her voice. I dried my hands and stood still long enough to feel the quiet complete its circle around me. Under the kitchen light, the lens blinked, and so did justice. I felt it even before the small indicator gave its quiet green pulse. The house had been dressed in ordinary evening clothes. The kettle at the back. The rosemary on the sill. A folded dish towel is waiting for steam. I set a pot on the front burner and left the flame cold. I wanted the stage to belong to whoever believed herself the lead. Nora waited 2 streets away in an unmarked sedan with a tablet balanced on her knee. She had walked me through the positions that afternoon in a voice that made steadiness contagious. She reminded me to keep my body loose and my tone hospitable. She said we were not performing fury. We were hosting it and watching it choose its seat. "Let her cook," she said. "She is seasoning her own sentence." "I never thought love could curdle," I answered, and felt the truth of it settle like a small stone in the mouth. Grace arrived with a cloth bag and a chatty weather report. Her hair was swept back, and her perfume found the corners of the room and held them the way a smile holds a photograph together. She opened the bag and lifted out a bundle of herbs and a jar of stock. She set them on the counter with an ease that felt practiced and kind if you did not know how to watch her hands. The lens above the pantry watched. I kept my movements slow. I rinsed rice in a metal bowl until the water ran mostly clear. I chopped an onion and let it sit so the sting would rise and pass. I placed a cutting board near the stove and left space for another pair of hands. Then I stepped away to fetch Andrew's containers from the basement fridge, where I had placed them earlier, stacked like a promise. When I came back, Grace was already at the stove as if the kitchen had tugged her there by a thread. She reached for the pot I had set and put her jar of stock inside it, as though offering comfort to a tired man. She spoke brightly about an event on Saturday where scent and music would braid, and how a portion of the proceeds could benefit the new foundation once it had a name. I nodded from the sink and asked what name she imagined. She said something airy with a woman in it, and a verb that makes donors feel like wind. She smiled at the burners. She had not turned any on. I busied myself with small, honest noises. The water glass was set down, the flick of the towel over my shoulder. The faint clink of a spoon against the lip of a bowl. The recording collected them and filed them under normal. Grace opened a drawer and took out a wooden spoon that had more memory than wood left in it. She trailed it along the dry bottom of the pot as if drawing a map. Her hand went into her bag and came out with a small vial that gleamed like nothing at all. I felt air leave the room. The footage would not feel that shift. It would only see. She palmed the vial near the pot and tilted. The movement was small and tidy, like a banker sliding a coin into a cuff. Powder fell in a soft white thread. It touched the dry metal. She stirred as if something might stick. She reached for the knob and finally turned the gas to low, and the flame answered with a blue ring. She added the stock, the honest stock, and the sound rose clean and domestic. She leaned in and breathed a little satisfied breath that the lens saw as a shallow rise of her shoulders. In Nora's car, the click of a still frame marked the first capture. On my end, the kitchen made its ordinary song. Burner size, spoon against pot, the smallest hollowness where innocence ought to live. I stood at the sink and let my hands rest on the rim to keep from testing how fast grief could cross a room. The pantry crown held the story in its glass eye. The recording had no opinion, it only obeyed. Grace sprinkled salt and twirled the spoon and added a sprig of thyme with theatrical delicacy. She told me she had a draft for a press release once our fund took shape. She said her friend could place us on a panel. She said the world loves a legacy with a wrist pulse. She peered at the simmer and said the pot needed a minute alone. Then she turned and rinsed her hands very thoroughly and dried them on the towel she had folded earlier. Clean as a costume, too. I asked her to set the table, and she did it with style. Plates a hand's width from the edge, forks kissing cloth just once. Candles are unlit because she knows I like to light them myself. This is how affection memorizes a house. This is also how calculation camouflages itself. She moved lightly to the living room for napkins, and her phone flared on the sideboard. One short vibration. Then stillness. I watched her see it, and not touch it. The discipline cost her a breath. Nora texted me a single word, clear, which meant we had enough in frame to call it what it was. She would still let the reel roll because greed rarely stops at enough. It wants a chorus. Grace returned to the stove and lifted the spoon to her lips and tasted, and smiled at the spoon like it had told a joke. She turned off the flame and portioned a small amount into a bowl as if for testing. She placed it on the counter near Andrew's usual spot. Then she reached into the bag again and produced a second vial. A new label, a new angle. She approached the bowl this time with a glance over her shoulder that read more like a reflex than fear. A second soft snowfall. The spoon stirred once. The lens did not blink. The little device made a faint click as it segmented the recording to a fresh file. Then a breath of silence. Then my own chest discovered its edge. I had warned myself not to imagine the slow harm that might have been done. I had promised the facts I would not smear the facts with fantasy. Even so, a picture tried to build itself. Andrew is at his desk. The spoon, the ring on his hand. The same hand wipes fatigue from his face. I pressed my palms flat again and found the edge of the sink, and the cold steadied me. Grace brought the bowl to the table and wiped a tidy circle where condensation had kissed the wood. She called down the hall in a voice so sweet it would rot if left on the counter. Andrew's dinner is ready. I answered from the doorway that he had been delayed and would pick up later. I watched her face digest the change. She covered it quickly with efficiency. She portioned 2 bowls for us and then paused with the ladle poised over a third, as if habit had outrun fact. She set the ladle down and reached for the salad. The jar of dressing she had brought glowed like amber on the sideboard. It crossed my mind that some jars are only what they claim to be. The thought offered no comfort. We ate very little. I made murmurs about the thyme and something pleasant in the broth. She lit into the salad with articulate enthusiasm. She wanted me to see how useful she was. She wanted me to see how seamlessly she could fill the space a donation might leave. She wanted me to want her as an heir to work and meaning, want builds tunnels where air should be. When the dishes were in the sink, she glanced at the clock and collected her bag. She asked if she should leave the rest for Andrew. I told her I would pack it later. She thanked me for a beautiful evening and kissed my cheek with precision. I walked her to the door and watched her slide into her car with that familiar smoothness. The engine turned. The car rolled into the street with its careful politeness and found the corner, and vanished. I shut the door and leaned my forehead against it. The house exhaled. My phone buzzed at my hip, and I moved to the living room where the second little watcher now lived among the books. Nora again. She asked if I could come to the precinct annex. Not urgent, she wrote. Ready. Bring only yourself. I turned off the kitchen light, and the room dropped into a softer shape. The lens above the pantry crowned the darkness with its tiny green dot. I picked up my coat and keys and left the house as if I were going to buy milk. In the annex, 2 rooms had been set aside. One with a table and 4 chairs, and a tired pot of coffee. One with screens I did not want to love and did. Nora sat forward with her sleeves pushed and her hair pulled into something that did not require attention. She tapped a key, and the footage filled the largest screen. We watched in silence first, then again with the timecode enlarged, then a third time with the view cropped tighter to her hands. There was no mistaking the vial, no charitable interpretation for the angle of the wrist, no cooking technique justifies a snowfall that arrives before the heat. Nora did not touch my arm. She did not narrate. She let the truth sit on its own chair. When the pass finished, she rewound to the second file where the bowl on the counter received its private attention. We listened to the soft scrape of spoon on ceramic and to the small breath of satisfaction that people make when they believe the world has agreed to their plan. Not a plan, I corrected myself. A setup and the wrong kind. We sat together until the white thread in my head had burned to black. Nora finally spoke. This is enough to speak in a different room now. We do not rush our own feet. We let the science add its stamp. She slid a printed form toward me, a laboratory courier request. She would take the pot and the bowl, and the residue collected from the rim of the container that Andrew did not touch. She would walk them through a chain of hands that respects every hinge. I signed. My name came out clean. I did not need to steady the pen. She asked if I wanted to watch the angle from the living room because sometimes seeing the whole body of a person while their hands do what they do will give a different kind of closure. I said yes and then wished I had said no. Grace moved beautifully. Even Malice can learn choreography. She tilted her head when she listened to the imaginary applause in her own mind. She straightened her shoulders at the stove like a woman stepping to a podium. She smoothed a strand of hair behind her ear just before she turned the second vial. All of it looked like hair. Only the contents told the truth. I asked Nora what happens now. She said we keep our faces exactly as they were yesterday. We tighten the circle around Andrew's food to 0. We collect one more day if she offers it. Sometimes the guilty like to repeat themselves for luck. Then we will choose the moment that compels a confession more clearly than handcuffs do. Her eyes met mine. You will not be alone in that room. We left the screens and returned to the smaller space, and she poured me coffee that tasted like endurance. She asked me to name what I feared most, so we could place it on a shelf with a label, instead of letting it run around the floor in the dark. I told her I feared missing some small edge where kindness still lives inside the person I had welcomed. She said, "Hold that kindness for yourself instead. You can return it to the world without returning it to her." The sentence found a place in me and stayed. On the drive home, the river wore a black scarf, and the bridges threw gold stitches across it. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 and let the city move at its honest pace around me. I did not turn on the radio. I wanted the sound of my own breath, and the small thrum of the engine, and the memory of that green blink under my pantry crown. No one hides from light forever. Most people only manage the trick for a short song. At my door, I paused and listened to the stillness inside as if the house could itself report the news. It answered with nothing at all, which felt correct. I stepped in. I washed my hands very carefully. I sealed the pot and the bowl for the courier with labels that told their quiet truth. I wrote a line to Andrew saying we were fine and that I loved him. Then I went to the mantel and wound my mother's clock a half turn. The spring took the tension and sang a soft metal yes. The tick resumed. The room agreed to witness another hour. Tomorrow would move us closer to the room where lies lose their names. Tonight, the lens had done its work, and the rest of the night belonged to breath. The hardest lie I ever told was that my son was gone. The words lived in my throat all afternoon while Nora and Dr. Caldwell rehearsed the beats that would carry us across a thin bridge. They checked the feed in the quiet room at St. Mary's, where a bed waited under a lattice of machines. The staff Nora trusted had prepped the monitors to posture a crisis and then a stillness. A microphone sat under the rail, another rested in the bouquet on the side table. A third lived in the seam of my cardigan, where it would hear whatever a person says when she believes the room belongs to her. I learned to move in a routine. I learned to breathe without telling my face I was lying. We staged the early part at my house because home makes truth look lazy. Andrew arrived on time and took the chair by the window and ate a small bowl of soup. I had watched from raw to steaming. His color was better. His voice is steadier. We discussed nothing important. We discussed the weather that ran out of enthusiasm halfway down the river and the neighbor's renovation that would not end. Grace entered 30 minutes later with a smile that dressed itself like hospitality. She placed a container on the counter. She patted my arm. She apologized to Andrew for the week he had carried. Andrew tipped his head the way he does when he wants to be kind to someone who has not earned it. I watched a clock breathe. I let the evening be itself until it was not. When it was time, Andrew let his hand drift to his chest, as if a cramp had caught him by surprise. He inhaled once sharply and stood too fast, and then the world tilted for him by design. He fell to the rug as gently as a napkin falling from a lap. His eyes closed with the practice of a man who learned to act in an afternoon for his life. I pressed my phone, and my voice reached for help that already waited at the curb. The siren stayed muted by agreement. The crew carried him on a stretcher with the solemn care they use for strangers, and I followed, gripping the rail because I needed to touch something that held. Grace wanted to ride along. She lifted her purse and announced her right to the place nearest the body. An EMT told her only one could go, and that the mother took priority because the law knows grief by blood. She swallowed the rule with difficulty and said she would follow in her car. Her hands shook not with fear but with fury that the script had put her in the hallway for a breath. She watched the stretcher move through the door, and she smoothed her hair. She smoothed her mouth. She walked quickly to the driveway and left rubber on the street that did not need it. At the unit, they curtained the room for a moment while Caldwell placed patches on Andrew's chest, and the nurse's hands organized tubes that would never bite. The display traced a careful rhythm, and then, on cue from a thumb you could not see, the flat line bled across the screen, and the steady tone arrived like a bright nail driven into the ear. Caldwell looked at me, and his features held their work steady. He whispered that the sedation they had used for a different case would keep Andrew very still, but not steal him from me. I placed my palm on my son's cool hand and felt the smallest answering heat in the center. Then I stepped back and let the lie find its mark. I texted Grace a single line. "Come now. He is gone." The words burned as they left my hands. Nora stood in the far corner dressed as a hospital shadow. She checked levels on the recording panels and nodded once toward the microphone buried in the bouquet. 2 white lilies had opened overnight like small trumpets, and one petal had loosened. It clung to itself a second longer, and then surrendered to gravity and fell to the sheet as if to bless it. I watched that fall and remembered every time my son stubbed a toe as a boy and tried not to cry. The body holds its own truth. The body keeps its own books. I waited at the doorway with a plastic cup I did not drink. My stomach was a room I could not enter. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and citrus, the way institutions try to disguise their purpose with a clean song. I counted 5 circles in the ceiling tile, and then I heard the click of hurried heels and a breath that had sprinted up the stairs. Grace appeared in the doorway with hair that had stopped being gentle. She had mascara under one eye as if a smudge had gone looking for a reason. She did not look at me first. She looked at the bed and swallowed. Then she pushed past with a sound that aimed at Keening and landed just left of it. She reached for his hand with fingers that had perfected touch for the benefit of a room. She patted the sheet where his wrist lay and lowered her head close to his chest. The microphone at the bed rail breathed her breath and waited. She did not cry in the old sense. She performed tears in little gasps that came on time. She turned slightly so she could lean in and let her mouth hover at his ear, and I watched her exhale a sentence she believed the air would keep. Finally free. The syllables did not trip. They did not apologize. They landed with a relief that sounded like a key finding its lock. I let the silence open between us and stay open. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, 4, 5. In that held space, the room felt like a held note that refuses to resolve. I stepped forward then and brushed the fallen petal from the sheet and let it slip from my fingers to the floor, where it lay like a tiny flag. I said so. Am I? The monitors paused their theater as Nora signaled the change. Andrew's eyelids lifted with precision, and his eyes found mine first, and then fixed on the woman bent over him. The shape of her face changed the way clay changes when a hand stops supporting it. She jerked backward with an animal sound that had not been trained to be polite. "What are you?" he managed, voice rough with the stillness we had asked of him. Or perhaps he meant to say, "What have you done?" Words are not precise when the veil tears. Grace staggered and caught the side rail and pinched it the way a person holds pain back by hurting a smaller piece of herself. "This is not possible," she muttered. "You were finished." The microphones heard finished. The recording tucked the word into its pocket with the others. The corridor door clicked open, and the quiet tone that had held the room released. The long whine on the monitor snapped to a hush. The knob turned with a soft crush of rubber and metal. 2 officers entered without the violent television that trains you to expect. Nora came in behind them with her badge in her palm and a folder under her arm. Caldwell stood by the foot of the bed like a witness whose oath lives in the work. The officer nearest the door spoke with the gravity of people who keep an ordinary tone even when the news is not ordinary. "We need you to stay very still," he told Grace. "We need you to listen." Grace searched the air for a face that might still belong to her. She found mine and then looked away because mine would not bend. She found Andrew and saw that his eyes no longer offered the hunger that had once kept her warm. She found the white lilies and the petals on the floor and realized the room had dressed itself for a different kind of ceremony. She shook her head. She said, "You are all cruel." She said, "This is a theater." I heard myself answer, "Yes, it is, and for once, it belongs to the truth." Nora opened the folder. She placed on the tray a printed still from the footage. A hand, a vial, powder falling in a house that had fed her. She placed a second image, the bowl that had waited on the counter opposite the stove. She read a notation from the lab about the residue we had sealed that carried the signature Caldwell had feared. She said the clinic had run its numbers twice. She said this room had heard the rest. Then she waited, because waiting is where lies fail. Grace tried to gather herself into the woman she has been this whole season. Spine straight, chin up, hands folded in the correct lap. But her breath moved as if she had swallowed a heavy coin and could not find a way to cough it out. She looked at Andrew and attempted one last chord from an old song. "I did this for us," she whispered. The word us cracked in the middle and fell apart. Andrew did not answer. His gaze held her without malice and without invitation. When love is finished, it goes blank. The officer stepped closer. He did not reach for her yet. He gave the kind of caution that leaves room for dignity to choose its ending. He told her she was not required to explain herself. He told her that whatever she offered now would walk beside her words later. She drew breath to argue and found only the hollow where argument used to live. "Finally free," she had said to a man she thought she had ended. The microphone had made a careful copy for anyone who needed it. I moved to the side table and closed my fingers around the cup I had abandoned. It was only water, but it felt weighty like a chalice in a small church. I thought of the white petal at my feet, and of the ones that had not let go. I thought of the sentence that first opened the day, and how it had refused to poison me entirely. Sometimes we must let a version of ourselves vanish so that what we love can stand back up. Sometimes we have to let a room pretend to grieve to make the living visible again. Caldwell quietly checked a line on the monitor and smiled at me with the corners of his mouth only. He said Andrew would likely sleep hard tonight. He said the body remembers even pretend stillness. I went to my son and touched his hair back the way I did when a fever broke when he was 8. Grace flinched as if the tenderness stung her. She tried to take a step toward him, and one of the officers lifted a palm that spoke no further. "Not now," he said. His tone had the patience of old stone. The lock on the corridor door gave one last click as another pair of officers arrived at the threshold. The sound felt like a book closing. Nora exhaled slowly. She thanked Caldwell for the quiet craftsmanship of the room. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and still believed in clean endings. She said, "We will go down the hall and write this on paper. We will not hurry. The truth is no longer a flame we have to cup against the wind." I turned once more toward Grace. She stood very still, as if motion would shatter something she needed to keep. The bouquet shifted in a small draft from the vent, and another white petal loosened and drifted down. It landed on the rail between us. A tiny soft flag, not for surrender, but for the end of pretending. I bent and lifted it, and let it rest in my palm. "You may keep the part of yourself that knows how to set a table," I said softly, for my own sake more than hers. "The rest belongs to the record now." They guided her from the room with more gentleness than she had practiced, and the corridor swallowed the shape of her. Andrew squeezed my fingers. It was slight, but it was there. I leaned close until I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. "We are not finished," I told him. "We are only finished with the part where a lie is allowed to breathe." The heart monitor answered with a steady line of small notes. Somewhere, a door opened and closed, and the hallway took on the sound of ordinary time again. In the corner, the bouquet stood its watch, and the lilies faced the ceiling and did not ask for more light. Behind the glass, I watched her deny herself into a corner. The room on the other side was the size of a modest kitchen and just as bare. Fluorescent light flattened everything into equal tone. A metal table. 2 chairs. A carafe of water is sweating onto a paper napkin. Grace sat with her hands folded and her spine so straight it looked like a prop. A public defender took the chair at her right. He leaned in and murmured something about patience and timing. She nodded without looking at him. She was studying her own reflection in the black eye of the wall where she thought the camera lived. She could not see me. The glass showed her only herself. Andrew stood beside me and placed his palm against the frame as if touch could read through. He had slept badly. His color was back, but the bones of his face were still too sharp. He whispered that he did not know what he would feel when this moment came. I told him feelings would sort themselves out later. We were here for the fact. Nora entered the room in a gray suit that carried no ornaments. She did not sit immediately. She moved the carafe a fraction so it would not drip onto the printed sheets she had laid down. She greeted Grace with the courtesy of someone who respects procedure more than performance. She advised her of her rights in a voice that was steady enough to hold a bridge. She said we were recording. She said we would begin with what could be measured and return to what could not at the end if there was anything left to say. Grace glanced at the lawyer and then at the lens that was not a lens at all but a pain hiding a pain. She said she would answer simple things. She said she wanted to clear up misunderstandings. Her tone had the gloss I knew from so many dinners. It had fooled strangers. It had fooled me. It would not fool the paper in this room. Nora began where science begins. She slid forward a page with numbers and ranges and the word arsenic typed without decoration. She described what the clinic panel had found and how the values had changed after Andrew stopped eating food he had not prepared. She named the residue captured from the lip of the container and from the pot on my stove and from the small bowl set aside. She did not add adjectives. She did not need to. Grace said it was a spice. Her hands did not move when she said it. She kept her voice light, like someone discussing salt that clumped in a damp cupboard. She said she had been trying to help Andrew because he had been so tired, and men never tell the truth about their own health. She said she had read online about supplements and immune support. She said she did not know what had been in the jar. The lawyer's eyes flicked to her at that last line. He looked the way people look when they realize the ground beneath a sentence has given out. Nora repeated the word supplement, as if it were a small bird that had landed on the table, and she wanted Grace to see it clearly. She asked about the jar. She asked where it had come from. Grace answered with a city at first, and then a friend, and then a website she could not recall. She built a path of fog and invited us to walk down it. Nora did not take the invitation. She slid a photograph across instead. A still image of a hand in a vial, and the first soft fall of powder in my kitchen before heat had been allowed to do its honest work. She let the picture sit where Grace could not avoid it. She did not say anything. She watched the eyes. Grace looked down like a child caught with a pen held at the edge of a white sofa. She said the photo was out of context. She said the kitchen had been full of steam and the jar had sweated and she had steadied it and the angle looked wrong. Nora touched the corner of the image with one finger and moved it a quarter-inch closer. Then she placed the second still beside it, the bowl on the counter. The spoon stirred once. The hand that had not turned toward the stove first. Some silences coax, and some silences close. This one closed. The lawyer cleared his throat and advised his client to remember she did not have to fill the room with sound. Nora acknowledged the advice with a small nod and turned to a printed form stamped with the clinic seal. She summarized the chain of custody. She named the people who had touched the evidence and how and when. She placed on the table the tiny recorder that had lived in my cardigan and another that had slept in the bouquet. She pressed a button and let 3 seconds breathe so we could hear the room's own air. Then a sentence entered the space like a blade wrapped in silk, finally free. She let it play once more. She did not look at me. She looked only at the woman across from her who had said those words into a man's ear when she believed the world had stopped. Grace's mouth tightened so sharply the lipstick cracked. She reached for the water and then decided thirst would be a kind of weakness. She steadied her hands on the metal instead. She said it was grief. She said she had meant free from suffering, that she had thought Andrew's pain had ended. On the other side of the glass, Andrew did not move, and I did not either. Grief has a sound I know by heart. That was not it. Nora did not argue. She reached for a final folder. She summarized without flourish the estate documents Harlan had kept and the revisions I had executed. She stated simply that the old language would have delivered control of certain assets into Grace's hands if time had broken a different way. She did not accuse the paper. She never does. She said the text had created an opportunity for someone who wished to claim what was not theirs, and that it had been removed. Then she spoke the line she had promised me she would speak when the edge of the moment arrived. "Truth is not mercy," she said, "but it is the first step." The room seemed to breathe out and in at once, like a chest learning a new rhythm. Grace watched the table as if content might rearrange itself while no one was looking. I saw the woman I had let into my cupboards, the one who folded towels with care and moved honey out of the sundae, the one who lit candles and pretended their flames were her idea of home. I felt the small bite of betrayal at the base of my throat, and I let it be what it was and no larger. Across the glass I could see a faint version of my own face. The pain held two women in the same space, and yet not. Nora asked one last time whether there was anything Grace wanted to add that would place her actions into a context that could be understood by the court. She did not say forgive, she said understand. The lawyer touched Grace's sleeve. He whispered that now would be the wisest place to stop. She shook him off with a small motion that looked like a habitual correction of her cuff. Then she lifted her eyes to the glass and spoke not to Nora, and not to the lawyer, and not to the file. She spoke to the place where she felt the world watching. She said she had grown up counting rent money spread on a linoleum floor that peeled at the corners. She said she learned early that security is louder than affection. She said Andrew had looked like a door that opened on a quieter room. She said I had looked like a guarantee. She swallowed, and for the first time, her voice wavered without being arranged. She said she just wanted the life she promised. The grammar was wrong and true. She hung between us. A mother, a city, a story a young woman tells herself about how the world should treat her if she can only be perfect enough. Andrew's breath fogged the glass for a moment. He pressed his fingertips to the pane and then stepped back as if to give her words the space they required. I felt nothing triumphant, only a thin sorrow that would take work to wring clean. I said in a tone that belonged only to me, and the glass she took lives for wealth. I will give life for meaning. Andrew turned his face toward me, and I saw the line of his jaw soften. Some promises grow in the soil of their opposite. This would be one. Nora let the admission lie on the table and did not chase it. She asked for clarifications that turned the story into a sequence. When had the first sprinkle happened? How often? From what jar? From where? Grace's answers were fragments at first, then phrases that matched dates, then a narrative she could not hold apart any longer from the facts we already had. The lawyer stopped trying to dam the river. He began to write not because he approved, but because the water had chosen its path. A clerk entered with a form and a pen and an extra witness. The pen made that particular sound old nibs make on heavy paper. A living scratch. Names were printed, times recorded. The admission became ink. The ink became a shape the court could carry. Nora summarized the record in a voice that would read the same tomorrow as it did now. She asked Grace to confirm each line. She nodded minutely, once, twice, 3 times. The clerk signed, the witness signed, the lawyer signed. The pen returned to its rest with a soft click. Through the glass, I felt the quiet of a door closing that had been open too long. Nora gathered the pages, squared them against the table, and looked toward the glass not to find me, but to acknowledge the work on both sides of the wall. She motioned to an officer who had been still in the corner, and he opened the door with the gentleness a hinge deserves. There was no rush. Justice does not run. It walks at the pace of breath and sentences. Grace stood when asked. She let her hands be bound the way rules require, and for the first time, her shoulders sagged as if her spine had remembered the truth before her mouth did. Andrew and I remained in the dim observation room after they were gone. The glass showed us only ourselves now, and nothing behind to tempt imagination. A music none of us had requested floated in from the hallway, the soft, unremarkable melody offices choose when they want to ease strangers through difficult chairs. Saturday. I felt the ache in my back that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the posture of holding still for days. Andrew lowered himself beside me and let his head rest against the wall for half a minute. He said he did not know whether to be angry or empty. I told him emptiness makes room for the right thing next. On our way out, Nora met us by the vending machine that had never worked properly. She asked whether we were ready for the next portion of the paper that would ask for signatures and patience. I said yes. She said something I did not know I needed until I heard it. Truth is not mercy, but it is the first step. The second is building something that can hold the weight of what you survived. She looked at Andrew when she said wait. She looked at me when she said build. Then she left us to find the corridor on our own. Back in the car, I let the engine idle while the rain began again in thin silver strings. I thought of the two-way mirror and how it holds a boundary that serves everyone in the room. It protects the process from the theater. It gives a woman like me a place to breathe and a place to speak, even if no one but my son will ever hear it. The words I had said in there stayed true out here in the damp light of the lot. She took lives for wealth. I will give life for meaning. I thought of the fund that was no longer a rumor and how it would have a door that locks from the inside for women who need exactly that. The paper had been harmed in one house. It would do good in mine. When we signed the last page of the evening, the pen made the same honest scratch. The clerk capped it, and the sound clicked like a small metronome closing. Somewhere down the hall, a radio stitched a bit of melody through the air. It was nothing you could name. It was enough. Justice had not raised its voice. It had only set out the evidence and let it stand. We stepped into the night with our coats pulled close and our breath visible and the feeling that the ground for the first time in weeks would hold. Some fires destroy, others teach you to see. I learned that at my own table, in my own kitchen, with my own hands. Weeks after the room with the two-way glass went quiet, days after the signatures dried into their permanent shapes, my house took back its ordinary music. The clock on the mantel kept a patient beat. The kettle sang when asked. The river outside the window moved the way rivers move when no one is staring. I could breathe through a full count again without bargaining for the second half of the breath. Andrew got color in his face that did not vanish when the afternoon dimmed. He came by with a sack of groceries and a tired grin that finally belonged to work and not to illness. He still rubbed his palm once across his chest now and then, more out of habit than pain, and each time he caught himself, he looked at me and laughed softly as if to apologize for surviving. Surviving changes your posture. It makes you stand without announcing yourself. The shop on Hawthorne smelled like orange peel and cedar, and a little like paint, because we were redoing the back room to hold files that would matter differently now. Customers brought small stories to the counter and left with something that made their houses feel kinder. My hand stacked boxes while my mind counted doors. The foundation existed in more than a drawer now. Papers had turned into a name, and the name had turned into a place on a lease where women could sit with keys in their palms and decide when a lock would turn. Harlan came by with a folder and a tired smile and told me that sometimes the cleanest justice is a well-run office. He held out a new pen. He said it belonged there. In the morning, we signed the final piece for the fund. I woke early and opened the back door to let the cold in. The yard wore a thin frost, and the rosemary looked like it had chosen to glitter for a few extra minutes before remembering it was a herb. I lit a candle and let the first little column of fire light the room. Flame is a good teacher. It asks for respect and offers clarity. I stood in the quiet and listened to the match scratch and catch. If this were a recording, someone could use that small sound like a hinge. In the office downtown, an easel held the logo our designer had made. A lighthouse without bravado, not a savior, only a keeper of shine. Andrew stood beside me in a jacket he wore like an older brother wears responsibility. Nora arrived in a suit that did not announce itself and rested a hand on my shoulder with the weight of a woman who has carried her own storms. Dr. Caldwell came too and leaned his cane against the wall and let the room see the kind of patience that never looks like hurry. We signed. The pen moved and made that living scratch that paper loves. The man from the bank shook our hands and told us we were the kind of donors who changed what a city thinks it can do. I did not believe him because I do not believe in names like donor. I believe in the hum of a door latch turning under a palm that has been told no too often. I believe in food in a cupboard where a woman knows who touched it. I believe in a light left on for exactly the person who needs it to be left on. After the little gathering, Andrew and I carried boxes into the new office. There was a window that framed the river. There was a table someone had sanded and polished until you could see your steadier self in it. Some chairs did not wobble. A young woman from a shelter across town slid a thank you card under the door in the afternoon, and I found it by accident hours later. The ink had smudged where she must have folded too fast. She wrote 3 lines, and the last one said, You will never know the sound my apartment makes when the lock clicks from the inside. The sentence sat down inside me and decided to stay. A letter came addressed to me at the shop a week after that. The envelope was the color of oatmeal, and the name of the detention center was printed without apology in the top corner. I stood at the counter and turned the thing over twice like it might leak. I did not open it there. I put it in my coat pocket and finished the day's small work. Later, at my kitchen table with the match tin within reach, the way you keep a friend near the door, I slid a finger under the flap and read. Grace's handwriting stood straighter than I remembered, as if confinement had put a ruler under every line. She spoke about a cot and a schedule, and the way night feels longer when it does not bring choice with it. She did not ask for anything. She told me that a counselor had used a word like accountability, and that word fit like an unfamiliar shoe. She wrote about a class, about women who had folded their faces the way she had learned to fold hers, and how folding is not the same as bowing. Near the end, she wrote a line that stopped my eyes, and then moved them. You made me see what love should have been. The ink blotted a little on the shoulder. I could almost hear the breath that made that happen. I put the letter back in the envelope and left it on the table and walked outside. The air had turned wet, and the first hush of a front coming in had made the yard smaller. I stood by the rosemary and let the wind lift my hair and thought about seeing. I thought about how my mother used to say, "Do you know what you are swallowing before you sweeten it?" I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vengeance cooling into a pretty shell. I felt an absence where fear used to sleep, and a new thing that might one day be forgiveness. Not today, not full, not erased. Forgiveness does not erase. It clarifies the edges and lets the truth be the truth without chewing you. I wrote back 3 lines. I told her the foundation would keep its promises, and that if she ever wanted to contribute to the world she had tried to take from, there would be ways that did not require her hands to touch my kitchen again. I wish her health and work. I told her that love is not a performance and not a guarantee, and not a ladder to a better room. Then I folded the paper and addressed it, and put a stamp in the corner like a small square of belief. Andrew came by that evening with takeout and a story about a coworker's new dog and the comic desperation of housebreaking. We ate at the table we had nearly lost. He looked around the room the way people look around, a place that has returned to being a place. He said, "Sometimes I can still hear that tone in the clinic under the beeping, and then I tell my brain to hear the bus brakes outside instead, and it works." I put my hand over his. He squeezed once and let go. He said, "You turned poison into light." He said it as if he were telling the table a fact, not giving me a medal. I felt the sentence land like a warm stone. I told him that is what mothers do. Later, we washed dishes without much talking. The window was a dark square, and the glass caught our reflections the way the two-way mirror had caught us weeks ago, only kinder now. The pantry molding held nothing but the shadow it was born for. The ceramic jar near the stove held wooden spoons, and no witness. I lined a row of clean bowls on a towel the way I used to line science files in a tray. These would hold soup and morning oatmeal, and maybe custard if a craving insisted. Peace can be domestic if you let it be. The next afternoon, I walked to the new office with a bag of candles wrapped in butcher paper so they would not clink. The receptionist showed me the room that would be used for intake interviews. It had 2 chairs facing each other and another chair angled slightly toward the window for when a person needs an escape route that does not require leaving. On the narrow shelf by the door, I placed a single taper in a small dish and a box of matches with a note that asked staff to strike one only when someone asked for it. Sometimes you need a visible spark to teach the brain it is not night anymore. Women began to come. They came with cartons and with nothing. They came with children riding their hips and with books held tight like a second heart. They came crying and not crying and with that fixed look some people wear when they have taught their faces to lie for too long. I learned to say welcome without announcing pity. I learned to say, how can we help without stealing anyone's agency? I learned that a bowl of soup handed with attention has a kind of heat that goes beyond the steam. At the shop, we added a small card near the register that reads that a portion of every purchase keeps a door closed from the inside for someone who needs it. The words did not plead, they did not sell. They told the truth. Customers lingered and then left quietly with their packages held with both hands, the way you carry warm bread. At closing, I turned out the lights in the back room and felt the deep relief of a day that had done what it meant to do. I still hear the night when it moves. Sometimes the house is too quiet and I find myself winding my mother's clock just for the sound and then standing there while the spring breathes that metallic yes. Sometimes I sit on the porch with a shawl and let the river teach me to count again. Sometimes I wake and cannot tell if the wind or a memory touched the eve. When that happens, I do a small thing that makes the world pick a side. I light a wick. I do it the old way with a match. The matchbox lives in the drawer where anyone who loves me can find it. I take one stick and listen to its little rasp and watch the head flare and then soften into usefulness. The wick accepts the flame and does not make a drama of it. It simply glows and stays. The room becomes a place where a person could see, not as bright as noon, not as surgical, only enough. On a Sunday when the clouds finally parted, Andrew and I drove to the coast and walked the flat sand the tide had left behind. He bent and gathered a few pieces of sea glass, the size of thumbnails, and handed me the green one. It looked like a melted bottle reborn. We stood and let the wind move through our jackets and the gulls stitch the sky with their arguments. He asked if I was happy. I told him I was not that word exactly. I told him I was steady. He nodded. He said that might be the better word anyway. We sat for a while on a driftwood log and watched the horizon level itself. He leaned his shoulder against mine, and I rested my head there the way mothers do, when no one is looking. We stayed until the light went soft enough to make the foam look like lace. When we walked back to the car, the sand took our steps and then gave them back to the ocean to erase. That night at home, I set a candle on the table and waited for the match to catch. The room accepted the small orange crown, and the brass clock ticked, and the window let in the faint sound of the city exhaling. I thought of the letter in my drawer and the woman who had already found the new door, and the hands that had guided them across the threshold without asking for more than a name. I thought of Grace standing in a room that had removed her choices and learning slowly that accounting and apology are not the same word. I struck the match and heard that soft flint song. I watched the wick bloom. If someone had been listening, they would have heard the little roar the tiny world makes right when it agrees to burn. The flame steadied. The house breathed. The night air from the river drifted through the screen and moved the curtain an inch and then an inch again. Some fires destroy. This one taught me to see. I let the glow hold until it did not need me. Then I leaned back and let the wind from the water carry the rest of the story away. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.